November 4th, 1974, 3:47 a.m. Frank Lucas sat in his living room in Teaneck, New Jersey, watching his mansion fill with federal agents. Detective Richie Roberts stood in the doorway, holding a warrant. Behind him, 40 DEA agents were tearing apart everything Frank had built. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. He'd outsmarted the Italian mob, revolutionized the drug trade, built a $52 million empire, and now, sitting in his $350,000 home surrounded by mink coats and custom suits, he realized something terrifying. The empire he'd built so carefully was about to become the evidence that would bury him. What happened in the next 72 hours wouldn't just destroy Frank Lucas. It would rewrite the rules of organized crime in America forever. To understand how Frank Lucas fell, you need to understand how high he'd climbed. 1968, Frank was a mid-level enforcer in Harlem, working for Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He was smart, disciplined, and observant. While other hustlers were flashy, Frank watched and learned. When Bumpy died of a heart attack in 1968, Frank saw an opportunity that would change everything. The heroin trade in Harlem was controlled by the Italian mafia. They imported product from Sicily, cut it multiple times, and sold it on the streets at 10% purity. Junkies needed more and more to get high. Dealers made less and less profit. The Italians controlled the supply chain, controlled the price, controlled everything. Frank looked at this system and asked one question: why are we buying from the middlemen? That question led him to Southeast Asia. 1969, Frank Lucas traveled to Bangkok, then to the Golden Triangle where Laos, Thailand, and Burma met. This was the heart of opium production. American soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin to cope with the horror of war, and Frank saw the source. He made contact with a Chinese-Thai businessman named Luechi Rubiwat, who controlled poppy fields in the mountains. Frank made Luechi an offer. "I'll buy directly from you. No middlemen. No Italian families. You get more money. I get better product. We both win." Luechi was skeptical. "How will you transport it? The Italians have the routes locked down." Frank smiled. "I have something they don't. American soldiers coming home from Vietnam." What Frank did next was brilliant and horrific. He created blue magic, heroin so pure, 98% to 100%, that it was unlike anything on American streets. He packaged it in blue tape to distinguish it from the competition. Then came the genius part, and the part that would eventually destroy him. Frank arranged to have blue magic smuggled into the United States inside the caskets of dead American soldiers returning from Vietnam. Think about that for a second. While families mourned their sons, Frank Lucas was using their coffins to build a drug empire. It was efficient. It was untraceable. It was also morally reprehensible. But Frank wasn't thinking about morality in 1970. He was thinking about money. By 1971, Frank Lucas was making $1 million per day. $1 million. Every single day. He had 50 people on his payroll, all family members from North Carolina. His brothers, cousins, nephews, he trusted blood over everyone else. He bought buildings in Harlem, legitimate businesses as fronts. He owned a dry cleaning chain, a taxi service, apartment complexes. He was laundering money faster than the government could track it. But here's where Frank made his first critical mistake. Despite his intelligence, despite his strategy, Frank Lucas couldn't resist the one thing that destroys every empire: ego. December 1971. Muhammad Ali fought Burt Terrell at Madison Square Garden. Frank Lucas showed up wearing a $100,000 chinchilla coat and a matching hat. He sat ringside, front and center, where every camera could see him. A nobody from North Carolina, dressed like a king, sitting with celebrities and mobsters. Richie Roberts was watching the fight on television at home. Richie was a detective in the Essex County Prosecutor's Office, known for two things: being incorruptible and being obsessed with taking down drug dealers. When he saw Frank Lucas in that chinchilla coat, something clicked. "Who is that?" Richie asked his partner. Nobody knows, his partner replied. That's Frank Lucas. Low-level guy from Harlem. Low-level guys don't wear $100,000 coats, Richie said quietly. Find out everything about him. That coat, that one moment of pride, put Frank Lucas on Richie Roberts' radar. And once Richie locked onto a target, he didn't let go. For the next 3 years, Richie investigated Frank Lucas. He followed the money, tracked shipments, built connections between Frank's legitimate businesses and his drug operation. But Frank was careful. Everything was compartmentalized. His family ran different parts of the operation. Money was cleaned through multiple businesses. There was no direct connection between Frank Lucas the businessman and Frank Lucas the drug lord. Richie needed a breakthrough. He got it from an unexpected source, the Italian mafia. By 1973, the Italian families realized Frank had cut them out completely. Blue magic was dominating Harlem, the Bronx, Brooklyn. Italian heroin, weak and expensive, couldn't compete. The families were losing millions. So they did what they always did when business was threatened. They tried to kill Frank Lucas. 2 attempts in 1973. Both failed. Frank had learned from Bumpy Johnson, stay 3 steps ahead. But the attempts told Richie Roberts something important. The Italians were scared of Frank. And scared people make mistakes. Richie made a decision. Instead of building a case against Frank directly, he'd pressure the Italians. Force them to expose their own operations. In the chaos, Frank's operation would reveal itself. It was a chess move. Sacrifice the obvious target to expose the real king. January 1974. Richie's team arrested 12 Italian distributors in coordinated raids across New York and New Jersey. They seized $4 million in heroin, but more importantly, they seized records. Financial records showing payments to suppliers. And one name kept appearing in the ledgers, not as a buyer, but as competition. Frank Lucas. Richie now had probable cause. In September 1974, he got approval for wiretaps on Frank's businesses. For 2 months, Richie's team listened to coded conversations. Shipments of furniture from Thailand. Dry cleaning delivery schedules. Everything sounded legitimate, but the timing matched known drug distribution patterns. Richie needed physical evidence. He needed to catch Frank with the product. That's when one of Frank's trusted couriers made a fatal mistake. October 28, 1974. A man named Shorty Bunn was pulled over for running a red light in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Routine traffic stop. But when the officer approached the car, Shorty panicked. He reached under his seat. The officer drew his weapon. Hands where I can see them. Shorty complied, but it was too late. The officer searched the vehicle and found $300,000 in cash hidden in a duffel bag. Shorty was arrested for money laundering. When Richie Roberts heard about the arrest, he personally interrogated Shorty for 14 hours straight. You're looking at 20 years, Richie said, leaning across the table. But I don't want you. I want your boss. Shorty stayed silent for 11 hours. Then Richie said something that changed everything. Shorty, Frank Lucas doesn't care about you. You think he's going to send a lawyer? Send money to your family? He'll replace you tomorrow and forget your name by next week. Shorty broke. Not completely, but enough. He gave Richie one detail. There's a shipment coming in November 1st. I don't know where, but it's big. That was all Richie needed. He petitioned for a full surveillance operation. November 1st, 1974. Richie's team followed 12 of Frank's known associates simultaneously. At 2:17 p.m., 3 cars converged on a warehouse in Newark. Richie watched from 200 yards away with binoculars. Frank Lucas himself was there, personally overseeing the operation. That was unusual. Frank rarely touched the product directly. Inside the warehouse, Frank's team was processing a shipment that had arrived that morning from Bangkok via military transport. 120 kilograms of pure heroin, street value $30 million. Frank was cutting it himself, packaging it in blue tape, preparing it for distribution. Richie had seen enough. At 4:33 p.m., federal agents stormed the warehouse. Frank Lucas was arrested with his hands literally in the product. There was no denying it, no explaining it away. Richie Roberts walked into that warehouse and looked Frank directly in the eyes. "Frank Lucas, you're under arrest for conspiracy to distribute narcotics." Frank didn't resist. He stood there in his $2,000 suit, surrounded by enough heroin to supply Harlem for 6 months, and he smiled. Not a happy smile. A resignation smile. "You got me, detective," Frank said quietly. "I knew someone would eventually. I just didn't think it would be you." "Why not me?" Richie asked. "Because you're honest," Frank replied. "And honest cops usually don't last long enough to catch guys like me." It was a compliment and an insult at the same time. Richie didn't respond. He just read Frank his rights. November 4th, 1974, 3:47 a.m. That's when 40 federal agents showed up at Frank's mansion in Teaneck. They had warrants for everything: his house, his cars, his businesses, his bank accounts. What they found was staggering. $52 million in cash and assets. Mink coats, jewelry, luxury cars, properties across 3 states. And records, detailed financial records that Frank had kept meticulously. Frank Lucas, the man who'd outsmarted the Italian mob, who'd revolutionized the drug trade, had made the same mistake that destroys every criminal: he'd kept receipts. Sitting in his living room, watching agents photograph his mink coats and count his money, Frank realized something. The empire he'd built so carefully, the wealth he'd accumulated, the respect he'd earned, none of it mattered now. It was all evidence. Richie Roberts sat down across from Frank at 5:12 a.m. "Frank, you're looking at life in prison. Multiple counts of conspiracy, distribution, money laundering. The federal prosecutor wants to make an example of you." Frank nodded slowly. "So what are you offering?" "Cooperation," Richie said. "You testify against your suppliers, your distributors, the corrupt cops and officials you paid off. You give us everything. In exchange, reduced sentence." Frank was silent for a long time. Then he asked, "How many people would I have to give up?" "Everyone," Richie said. "Everyone who helped you build this. Everyone who profited from it. You burn it all down." Frank looked around his living room, at the imported furniture, the original artwork, the symbols of success. "You know what the worst part is, detective?" Frank said quietly. "I actually thought I could keep it. I thought I was smarter than everyone who came before me. Bumpy told me once, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. I should have listened. So will you cooperate?" Richie asked. Frank Lucas made a decision that morning that would save his life but destroy his legend. "Yes," he said. "I'll give you everything." Over the next 18 months, Frank Lucas testified against 40 people. Police officers who'd taken bribes. DEA agents who'd looked the other way. His own family members who'd helped run the operation. Italian mobsters who'd tried to kill him. He gave up names, dates, locations, everything. The testimony didn't just dismantle Frank's empire. It exposed corruption throughout New York's law enforcement and criminal underworld. In return for his cooperation, Frank's sentence was reduced from life to 15 years. He served 7 years in federal prison before being released in 1981. But freedom came with a price. In 1984, Frank was caught participating in another drug deal, a small-time operation compared to his Blue Magic empire. He was sent back to prison for another 7 years. Frank Lucas was finally released in 1991. He was 60 years old. The $52 million was gone, seized by the government. The mansion, the cars, the businesses, all liquidated. He lived in a tiny apartment in New Jersey, working odd jobs, largely forgotten. Years later, a reporter asked Frank if he regretted his cooperation with Richie Roberts. Frank thought for a long moment. I regret everything, he said. Not the cooperation. Everything before it. I built an empire on human suffering. I used the coffins of dead soldiers. I poisoned my own community. I told myself it was just business, but that was a lie. It was greed. And greed always costs more than you make. Do you think the empire was worth it? The reporter asked. Frank Lucas, the man who'd once made $1 million per day, who'd worn $100,000 coats, who'd outsmarted the mob, looked at his empty apartment and said 5 words that summarized everything. I paid for every dollar. The story of Frank Lucas isn't really about drugs or money or empire. It's about the price of ambition without conscience. Frank was brilliant. He saw an opportunity and seized it. He revolutionized an industry. He outsmarted powerful enemies. But brilliance without ethics is just a faster route to destruction. That chinchilla coat, the one Frank wore to the alley fight, became the most expensive piece of clothing in history. Not because of its price tag, but because of what it cost him. 7 years in prison the first time. 7 more the second time. His family's respect. His community's trust. His freedom. His fortune. Everything. Richie Roberts continued working as a prosecutor and later became a defense attorney. He and Frank developed an unlikely friendship. Richie once said, Frank was the smartest criminal I ever chased. And that intelligence is exactly what made him so dangerous, not to me, to himself. Frank Lucas died in 2019 at age 88. He spent his final years giving speeches to at-risk youth, warning them about the cost of the criminal life. I made millions, he'd tell them. And I'd give every penny back to undo what I did. You think you're building something, but you're just building your own prison. The lesson here isn't complicated. Power built on destruction destroys the builder. Wealth gained through suffering buys nothing but regret. And empires built without honor collapse under their own weight. Frank Lucas proved you can outsmart everyone except the consequences of your choices. This story made you think. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you understand that true success isn't about how much you gain, but what you keep when everything falls apart. Share this with someone who needs to hear that shortcuts to wealth are just longer roads to regret. And in the comments, let me know, what would you have done differently if you were Frank Lucas at the height of his power? Turn on notifications because next time, we're telling the story of how one honest cop took down an entire corrupt system. You don't want to miss that. Remember, respect isn't bought with money. It's earned through choices that you can live with when the empire falls.